Welcome to the latest of our videos with Latitude. Today we have Helen Sharman, Britain's first astronaut. So Helen, it's the 35th anniversary of your trip to space this week. I'm just keen if we could kind of start off by rewinding to how you ended up on the space station and how the journey into space before you'd actually got there, how that all went.
I can hardly believe myself that it is 35 years. Honestly, I mean, it's just, it feels like it was yesterday in so many respects. And of course, it's such an intense period. And it's not just that time in space, it is all of the run up that's so focused and so exciting in many respects. Because, for me, it was so different. I'd been a scientist in industry, really loving that and enjoyed the variety that gave me, and the different people I was working with. Had no thought about going into space. It just wasn't possible for British people then until towards the end of the Cold War. President Gorbachev was opening up the Soviet space program to Western countries as a way of kind of soft diplomacy, I suppose, but to give different countries the opportunity to fly somebody from there, from one of their nationals, into space and to do some experiments on the Mir space station, which is the space station that was in orbit, before we had the International Space Station. And so, yeah, I heard this amazing opportunity actually on my car radio as I was driving home from work. But it was basically a job advert. And so they described this opportunity to go and train with cosmonauts, and then subsequently, hopefully, to go into space and do experiments up there. So for me, that whole amazing joy of yeah, really, I think I was thinking about the training, if I'm honest, rather than the time in space. But that variety of doing a bit of physical training, a bit of language learning, because all the training was going to be done in the Russian language. And so it's that combination of culture and science, and really getting to grips with what human spaceflight was all about. The last time I'd really thought much about it was probably when I was 6 years old and the Apollo missions were going off. So yeah, it was just such a fabulous time, so intense and yet so still so clear, but fun as well. It was such an amazing experience.
I know you've said before that the training was almost as kind of transformative as the trip. Could you take us a bit through how that intense period, what you were actually up to day to day and what that training actually looks like?
We had 3 months to begin with of getting to grips with the Russian language. I had a lovely Russian teacher called Igor. Remember him so clearly. And he was a linguist, a Russian linguist, at a big university in the center of Moscow. And he'd taught previously other foreign astronauts as they were doing their training. And so he was understood how to teach Russian to people that didn't understand any. But nonetheless, that was, I think, probably the hardest part of the training because, just really feeling so tired. It was Russian all the time. And I spoke, I would say nothing. I mean, next to little. I think we all know da and niet, don't we? And I'd learned to count up to 10 and some very, very basic stuff. But it's been a very intense kind of selection process, really.
Yeah.
So yeah, but the Russian language was for me was a joy as well because when I was choosing what I wanted to study after school, I really struggled whether I was going to go down the sciences route or the languages route or something else because I just love variety in life. And I chose the sciences but missed the languages a bit. So this was just a joy to be able to learn to understand them, of course, and speak Russian. But when we'd got 3 months of language learning under our belt and some physical training as well, and I say our belt because there were two of us doing all this training, two British people. One of us would actually fly into space, and the other one would remain on the ground as a backup. But we didn't know for most of the training who was going to get which role. So yeah, but we were going through it together. But yes, after we'd done the 3 months of language learning, of course, that language training continued throughout the whole mission, the whole training, and But then we had started what I'd call proper training, so learning about astronavigation, so really using the stars as a map, looking at orbital mechanics. Fortunately, very maths based, because then I didn't need so much language to understand what what the tutors were talking about. And it got more practical, so we'd learn about the electronic systems, life support systems. We'd go in the simulators, the Soyuz simulator, the spacecraft that actually sits on top of the rocket and gets us to the space station. And then, of course, there was the simulator of the space station itself. So that was all wonderful and great. I love practical stuff as well. And then the emergency training. So what would happen if instead of coming back to Earth and landing on a nice flat part of Kazakhstan where we intended to land, what would happen if there was an emergency in space and we ended up returning to Earth in the sea? So that was also, for me, a really interesting, I suppose, partly a physical endurance thing, but also understanding, how to get winched up into a helicopter. So, I haven't come out of the army or anything like that. So even that kind of experience was quite a novelty for me. So yeah, so I just loved it. And I thought it was just such an amazing opportunity to experience all those different kind of, I'll say challenges, but I felt as though I had all the support, so I didn't feel as though it was in any way a real. How can my Russian's coming back to me now. Sort of a trudnosti, I was going to say, a real sort of a real mental and physical effort, not too much.
Yeah, and does that have the effect? Because I imagine most people, I certainly would, if I had to think of all of those things. I mean, both are perfectly, a takeoff and landing that went perfectly well. But as you say, there's also always the threat of it not doing. Feels like a terrifying prospect. But is it the case that once you've done all that work and you know what's happening, that you've got that sense of control, it's not so terrifying, or was that element still there?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's. I think we're fearful of the unknown, aren't we? That's what we're scared of. And when we do find out about not only the actual situation, but I think it's feeling comfortable that you know yourself what to do. So it's yes, it's what the situation is, but it's what's going to happen, which of course the simulator told us a lot of. How I needed to first, I mean, I suppose I was going to say react, but it's some of it is a reaction. So some of it, if it's an emergency, you're trained how to react to that particular emergency, and we trained for a number of different types of emergencies. And one, for instance, was a docking onto the space station. So we ended up having to carry that out, although it was an unplanned thing. It wasn't such what I call an emergency that needed to be done in split seconds time. Many of the systems are very complex, and yes, you need to know what to do, but you've got time to work out the
Yeah.
nuances of the situation. And again, because you've got that background knowledge of the training, it's one of the reasons why if some of the astronaut training is still quite long. If you're just going to go up into space as a passenger, as increasingly astronauts can do, if you've got it's an automatic spacecraft, if you've got a commander that can do anything else that's necessary with the spacecraft, then you can just train for a few weeks on the work that you personally need to do and how to be safe. But yes, for us, very much it was part of operating the spacecraft. So yes, so in a manual docking scenario, we each had our own jobs to do, but we were working together as a team. Something we'd trained to do in the simulators, but of course you never know exactly what scenario it's going to be. So yes, you discuss that with your crew. You give your own input. You listen to their input. You work out who's going to do what at which time, and then you get on with it. So there's immediate emergencies.
Yeah.
There's emergencies that could be life threatening, but actually you've got plenty of time. And then there's the other stuff, which is really just sort of working through perhaps technical issues, other kind of things that we many of us do, every day of our lives. And that's one of the great abilities of human species, right? We can think and we can communicate and we can learn, and we're learning all the time, even in space. So yeah, it's a combination of those kind of things that the training gets you through to doing.
Yeah, and you mentioned that learning. Obviously, a lot of the work once you'd actually done that docking and got into the space station was real scientific, experimental study. Could you run me through what you were kind of up to and what those helped us and helped you find?
I really enjoyed the variety again of experiments that I had. And although actually I was saddened in the end, I had to do not British experiments. Now, the plan was that the mission would have done a whole load of experiments from UK researchers and industry. But because of the way that the mission was managed and the funding and everything around the time, in the end, a new agreement was made, really more of a collaboration with the Soviet Space Agency. So I ran a whole load of Soviet experiments. Of course, the information comes back to science in the end. So as a scientist, that's pleasing. But I was saddened that I couldn't have done some of the amazing science that had already been developed for those experiments. But it meant that I had a variety that I might not otherwise have had because the Russians were really keen to show off, really, to the rest of the world some of their capabilities. So there would be things like, yes, how my body was adapting to feeling weightless. So I knew from theory, but I was taking blood samples and other samples from my crewmates as well. So that was quite interesting. And something as simple as, let's say, if you close your eyes and then try and track a horizontal with your hands. So looking at how I was writing in a straight line, for instance, or maneuvering certain equipment, could I do that without having this input to my brain from my balance system in my ears about what's up and down? So that kind of adaptation. But there were things like things that, I'm a chemist. Chemistry is my subject, and growing crystals for somebody who's done chemistry has to be one of the, sort of the best things, I think. And well, that and colour. But anyway, crystals was pretty good. And to be able to grow certain crystals in space that you just can't grow very well on Earth. And these are protein crystals. And we can't grow them very well on Earth. We can grow protein crystals, but they're small and they tend, with the molecules inside the crystals, tend to be often badly oriented. So we can't get good information from that crystal. But you can grow them wonderfully in space. So be able to do some protein crystal growth. And probably my favorite experiment was using the airlock. Now, this was not the airlock that we used to go out and do a spacewalk with, but the airlock, an experimental airlock, in the floor of what I'd call the main base block. So the main habitation area, the main control part of the space station. And there was an airlock there where I could expose some of my experiments to the vacuum and radiation of space. And so I was looking at some very thin ceramic films, put them all on a frame, and then expose these films to vacuum and radiation of space, and then after a few days brought them back into the space station and analysed them and also brought them back to Earth. So we were looking at future spacecraft materials. So yeah, just fascinating to see how these different different materials and different types of investigations can be done. We're looking at mostly at feeling weightless, and I'll say microgravity because gravity is still there, of course. We're in low Earth orbit. Gravity is pretty strong. We don't feel it, so we talk about microgravity. But yeah, it's that, and it's the radiation of space. Sometimes it's the vacuum, and yeah, it's just such a joy to be able to think about some of these effects that, as a scientist on Earth, you're not often, engaging your brain in because we've always got gravity that's affecting us on Earth.
Yeah. And how much, I mean, obviously the science work will give you the data and the findings and all those that you can bring back, but there must be an awful lot. I mean, there's so much that you felt that barely anyone else on Earth has ever felt. And, we're speaking ahead of you speaking at Latitude. It must be a strange experience to come back down and to, have to communicate that feeling, say, of weightlessness to people who at least haven't and probably never will go anywhere near it. Is that a kind of challenge of communication? Do you find that it's easy to get that across, those strange and unfelt feelings?
Straight after my space mission, I knew I wanted to share it with the rest of the country because it wasn't just my space mission, right? It was the UK space mission, the first human mission that had happened. Um, and if I'm honest, at the beginning, it was really difficult. And I think partly it's trying to put yourself in other people's shoes. Um, there was a lot of misinformation as well around at the time, not about spaceflight, but I mean misinformation that I had about what people were interested in, and people pretty intelligent and pretty curious by and large, I think, especially certain audiences at certain festivals, and it's just a joy to see spaceflight from their perspective. One of the things I did after my spaceflight was go into a whole load of schools, and the children give you such wonderful immediate feedback when you're talking to young people. They don't sit politely and listen if you're being completely incomprehensible or boring. Children fidget, they're turning around, they're chatting, so you know. And the teachers also were very, very helpful. And actually, I learned very quickly about communicating these kind of things. But yes, feeling weightless is actually the most natural and relaxing feeling you can possibly imagine. I think the nearest on Earth is when you go into a swimming pool and you just float. And I still do that now. I'll go and sort of lie on my back with my arms out, close my eyes and do a star float.
Yeah.
And of course, the water is keeping you buoyant in a swimming pool. You don't have water around you to keep you buoyant in space. You don't need it. But yes, that idea of just freely floating in nothing, to be able to just twist and do a somersault,
Mm.
and just keep on moving is just fabulous.
And we mentioned earlier it's 35 years since you went. It's been I would say, kind of up and down time for space flight. Obviously, I think both in terms of the actual technologies we have, but also public perception of both how much they can believe in it and how useful it is and all of those things. Over those 35 years, what's your sense of what's changed both about, the space agencies and the work they're doing, but also how people feel about spaceflight and its value and whether we should even be pursuing it given the various challenges we have down here?
Oh, I think there's been huge change. I mean, first of all, after my space flight, I felt as though 90% of the questions from journalists, at least, not necessarily from the public. I think the general public was just fascinated by the whole concept. But a lot of the questions were about, the value of humans in space. Isn't it better just to send robots? And of course, the answer is we need to send both, and humans and technology work brilliantly together, and we can do so much more when we do work together like that. So yes, but I think in terms of commercialization of space flight, so that's changed that kind of the way that we do things, and also then I think that has implications in terms of how we want to use space in the future. So when we're thinking about cooperation with other entities, and I say entities because it's not always just going to be another country, it's not always going to be another space agency that you might be competing with for the best bit of the moon's surface, let's say, to do your experiment on. So we need to cooperate and understand how we're going to do that better internationally. All the idea about really good international collaboration. So it's not just about making it cheaper and getting perhaps your own space mission. Let's say the Artemis 2 mission that went off around the moon recently. Wonderful, and it was so exciting to see what they were doing. But the fact that there was, the part of the Orion spacecraft, the service module, is a European service module. So the Americans were keen very much to have that international collaboration there, apart from, of course, the Canadian astronaut who I think British people were going, yeah, it's part of the Commonwealth, so we feel as though he's a bit like us at least. So there is certainly a lot of that going on for all sorts of reasons. But I think collaboration in terms of making best use of the Earth's resources and the resources, let's say, on the surface of the moon when we get there, we all are going to want to have, let's say, some water, a water supply, some energy generation. We're going to need to make sure that we don't contaminate the lunar surface. So there's all of that to work on, I think, and that's one of the perhaps I think the sidelines of space flight right now, which is quite interesting to get it and to understand that how we might be deliberating that ethically as well. So people that might not have really been interested before in perhaps the technology of spaceflight, but now really I think it's the time is to get the public discourse going, to get all sorts of people talking to each other. Let's debate this in public. Let's have this more on the radio so we can start to really influence how space is used so that we're all best using it. And we don't overuse Earth's or Moon's resources in the process. This is the beginning, of course, of perhaps even going further into space and using Mars. We've been talking about using asteroids and mining asteroids. So the ethics of that, how much of an asteroid should we use? What happens if you nudge an asteroid out of its trajectory onto the course of perhaps so that it's going to impact somebody else's satellite? Or perhaps worse, hit the Earth, right? So all of those kind of things, it's right that we all get involved in that debate. So yeah, great fun. So all of that's changed, as well as, of course, the technology. When we think about human space flight, I think back to my time on the Mir space station. A lot of people will say that the difference between Mir space station and the International Space Station is a bit like, well, International Space Station, four-star hotel, 24/7 communications, gourmet food every now and again. Mir space station, think more like a family camping trip. But I love camping, so it was fine for me.
Euro camping space, which I mean, it's interesting because we're obviously also at this, what feels like a really pivotal point for private spaceflight and spaceflight as kind of tourism, Blue Origin and all of those things. What do you think about the spectacle of say Katy Perry being put up in space? Just have a look. It feels much less of a kind of scientific exercise and more of a new frontier for going on holiday, to use your metaphor.
So I think there's a number of different sides to this, really, isn't there? So tourism as a general thing, I think is can be positive because, of course, it brings in funds to, let's say, if we're talking about space tourism, it brings in funds to the space industry that then we can use, and hopefully, if we get all the ethics right and we've debated this properly, we can use it for the right purposes. There are certain, let's say, like you say, spectacle space flights have not necessarily even brought in money. That they've been, as far as we can see, and there's been this particular space flight that you're talking about, didn't generate any money directly, but actually, of course, a load of publicity, which in itself might have raised some investment, but it certainly generated publicity for another cause. So that's, I think, the question is, what are we then using space for? That's why I think it's really important to get this debated properly. But also, are we just going to, there's always a downside. Space can be wonderful in terms of helping us to mitigate climate change, helping us to understand global warming and what we can do about it, for instance, and so many other things, medical devices, loads of good stuff that we can do in space. But the downside is that are we creating, let's say, orbital debris around the Earth, possibly around the moon? So stuff that we perhaps might not be able to get rid of. We don't know yet how to get rid of a lot of this stuff. Are we contaminating the Earth's atmosphere? A little bit by the rockets that are going through the atmosphere at the moment. It's insignificant at the moment compared to air travel and other pollution, but it could become more significant. What about the spacecraft that are burning up in the atmosphere on their way back to Earth? That's something we need to really consider. So I think, yes, it's great to have tourism generally, so long as we're bringing in money and using it for the right purposes, but we have to be careful that it is sustainable, and that more than sustainable, we're not, we're doing things, I think, ethically, generally speaking, as well. So yeah, lots of different sides to tourism, and that's just one part of spaceflight, right?
Yeah, and as you say, I suppose those are all questions that actually we as people who are staying down here and have no real role in it, no hands-on role at least, do need to be brought into, right? Which is presumably the importance of things like speaking at Cosmic Shambles, that you're having this conversation in public with the public and getting people's positions on those kind of ethical, political, really knotty, difficult questions that everyone should get a say in, even if they're staying down here, at least for now.
Yeah, absolutely. And people's questions, just hearing what people are saying. If I can perhaps just influence some people to think about it a bit, and perhaps to read a little bit more and to engage in that public discourse. The United Nations is already undergoing some of these discussions. Of course, they're painfully slow, as UN discussions often are, but they're bringing in all sorts of different ideas, different cultures, different countries, and that's great. But if I can influence what I'd call some just people that aren't necessarily involved in those high level discussions, in the people who are not necessarily the negotiators, the diplomats. So regular people whose lives are going to be impacted by space flight, like our lives are impacted by electricity, right? It's a very space flight is just so integral in our lives, even now, and will become more so. Younger people, especially. as they look about at how technology is going to be influencing their lives, and how we use space for that. Not just for them going into space, many more of them will, but how are they going to use space in their lives in an appropriate way? So I think it's important. Um, we've had this huge, rapid development of technology generally in the last few decades, and spaceflight's part of that. We think that the first ever spacecraft, Sputnik, went into space in 1957. It's a blink ago, really. I know many of us weren't alive then, but nonetheless, in terms of the development of technology, very, very recently, and how much further have we gone since then? And how rapidly we've been able to integrate space and send people there and understand about it and communicate it. So yeah, I think we all need to get involved in that, and it's fascinating, I think, because there is this combination of culture, ethics, legal stuff, technology, and just what is it like? What's it feel like? And for humans, when we go there, how does that change us? Why is that different from sending a robot into space? What
Mm.
does it make you feel? How do we think in space? So I think that's also very interesting, and it helps people to, again, to look back on their own lives and perhaps reprioritize sometimes.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, I'm both conscious that we're about to get kicked out here and we're about to get kicked out of the Zoom, and that also feels like an incredibly profound, moving place to end. So, thank you ever so much for your time. It's been a real, genuine honour and privilege to chat. So, thank you ever so much.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure. I'd say just thanks for the opportunity. And yeah, I'm just so looking forward to coming to Latitude. It's just such a great audience, I think, because they are interested in so many different aspects of life. And I like, that people are also interested in each other at Latitude. You get this great diversity across the people there. And that really supports that combination of music and art, culture, science. And spaceflight is just on that intersection, I think, between all of that.